BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech. For biotech companies striving to bring innovative therapies to market and maximize patient impact, IQVIA Biotech is the trusted CRO of choice. Backed by 25 years of unparalleled experience and deep therapeutic expertise, our full-service clinical development solutions are purpose-built to accelerate success. IQVIA Biotech helps early-stage biotechs de-risk by developing strategic clinical development plans, guiding drug candidates along the most promising pathways. Leverage data-driven models and dynamic tools to craft a compelling value story, attract investment, and maintain momentum through every phase of drug development.
While China surges, the U.S. biotech sector isn't yet ready for liftoff. A discussion of BioCentury's third quarter financial markets preview. Plus, how the coming quantum computing revolution could impact biopharma and the first 100 days of FDA Commissioner Marty Makary. We'll discuss all of this on today's BioCentury This Week. I'm Stephen Hansen, one of the directors of Biopharma Intelligence here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues,
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Karen Tkach-Tesman, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
Before we dive into these topics, we do need to have a brief discussion about the only major sporting event where the umpire has to remind fans not to pop champagne corks during play, my esteemed colleague, Simone, all-time favorite event, and that is Wimbledon. So Simone, I'm going to allot you 2 minutes to rant or vent or whatever have you. The floor is yours.
Well, I have to tell you, the champagne popping was sadly not the most embarrassing thing about this weekend at Wimbledon. And it wasn't even the disastrous 6-love double bagel that was the women's final that was the worst. The worst is what this terrible sport does in terms of making somebody who has just lost one of the most important moments of their life stand up in front of an entire audience of 15,000 people there and however many people globally and explain themselves. And I feel that this is one of the cruelest moments in sports. And I was trying to think of what is the biopharma equivalent of that? It's like your clinical trial failed, your company went under, and you got to tell, I don't know, an entire audience of your peers. Like, what would be the equivalent of how embarrassing that is?
Is it like having your company presentation at Bio and then that morning announcing, basically your lead program failed and you have to explain yourself at your presentation, maybe?
Maybe, but, there's nowhere to hide kind of thing. So, it could be that.
Maybe it's like being FDA commissioner and getting fired after 3 days because it turned out that you had failed to disclose your ownership of stocks and companies that are regulated by the FDA. I remember that happening.
Maybe. I think, I'll invite our audience to go off into their own lives and figure out the equivalent. But I have to say, dear audience, if you are in that situation, then maybe you would watch Amanda Anisova's very, very gracious speech where she didn't run away. I mean, she did try a little bit, but who wouldn't? But she didn't go and put her head in a bucket, and she stood proud, and she'd done a great thing to get there, as has maybe your FDA commissioner, Steve, in that embodiment in getting appointed in the first place, Stephen, or your executive CEO and having even got that program all the way to the end point. So there's always something along the way. But anyway, sure. It was a good tournament and the end did not. Oh, and the men's was a good match as well, but not the classic that we wanted to. So just understand the journey is sometimes more exciting than the actual denouement can be. That's my Wimbledon sum up for you all. And please send us in your most embarrassing moments. We would love to talk about, have a special episode of everybody's most embarrassing moments that we could read out to an audience of thousands.
I've just been left wanting a double bagel.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Well, there you go. Well, I did promise you, Simone, that I would give you some Wimbledon airtime after I forgot to bring it up last time. So there you are. So we just published our third quarter financial markets preview story. And Simone, I know you also wrote a perspective piece that kind of riffs off some of those topics as well that we discussed there. So I actually wanted to ask you, where do you want to start? Should we start with the good or with the bad?
Is there an ugly?
Not really. There's not really an ugly. It's mostly, I framed it mostly around good or bad. Where do you want to start?
Um, why don't you tell us the good news, Stephen? Everybody could use a dose of good news.
Good. I was going to start with the good news regardless of what you said, so I'm glad that you went with the good news.
I love that I have so much influence.
Well, the good. So I guess that's the nice thing. I feel like I have a couple good things that we can talk about, but I think the one that we'll start with is about sort of the resurgence that we've seen from China and their public markets so far this year. So I had several investors sort of opining to me that they thought that China's public markets were essentially kind of on their deathbed, like less than a year ago, that basically things were not great. But this year, they've been by far the best performing part of the biopharma sector. Obviously, a lot of that is playing on sort of the new company formation theme and the pharma deal bonanza that we've seen and that we've been covering quite extensively so far this year. So just to give it a few numbers here, we looked at a group of Chinese biotechs that were valued at over $500 million and listed on the Hong Kong Exchange or NASDAQ. And that group so far this year has a median share price performance of about 56% up, with only 13 of those 54 companies there down year to date. Just for a bit of context, that same group minus 4 new listings this year had a median share price performance of minus 15% last year. So overall, that's really the one kind of bright spot on the public markets that the sector is really soaring. And also what that's translated into is kind of renewed interest in putting capital back to work in these Chinese companies. So had another investor, telling me stories about how they had been investing in China for a long time. And for a long time, they were really one of the only few Western investors that was there making these deals. And now they were saying that they were seeing, lots of familiar specialist hedge fund names showing up as cornerstone investors, taking positions in these Chinese companies. So that was something that, he saw as sort of a real positive.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that point. I know we've got more to discuss, but really, this is the year, if you ask me, where Western investors and Western biotechs have really, really understood that China is a force in biotech. We'll talk more about it, but your point there about investors, Stephen, yeah. I don't think I've had a time since I've been at BioCentury where I've had so many investors telling me they are just on the ground in China searching for opportunities. It's not that they went over for a deal. They've got people on the ground there searching all the time. And that's just a sea change.
Yeah. It's really interesting hearing that, from where I'm sitting in Washington, because remember last year was the year of Biosecure, and the antipathy toward China among the political establishment in Washington in both parties hasn't diminished a bit. And I wonder if people have just discounted that, if investors discount that, and they think that it's not likely to have any impact, or if they think that somehow biopharma will be carved out from whatever steps happen to disrupt the economic ties between the United States and China.
Yeah, Steve, we will be publishing this much talked about analysis of deals between Asia biotechs and Western biotechs and farmers. And certainly after the Biosecure bill was announced, there was an absolute slowdown in deals and an absolute, you could really feel it in talking to people, chilling of the sector. To your point, I think there's now, frankly, I would just call it a complete detachment. I don't know if Washington is detached from the rest of the country or biotech is detached from Washington, but nobody seems to be very concerned about that. Rather, they are looking at the opportunity, and there's a certain realpolitik, I don't know if that's an okay term to use here, but there's a certain realpolitik here whereby in the West, things are not looking that great. Companies need deals, they need money. China, things are taking off and there's innovation there and there's a cost arbitrage. So whether it's pragmatism, which is partly what I think it is, or just, I think you hinted at the idea that maybe people don't believe that terribly adverse policies are going to come to fruition. That is possible as well. But either way, there's an absolute disconnect between those things.
And that reminds me of the disconnect between how Washington talks about M&A and, consolidation and antitrust or whatever, and how the industry looks at the life cycle of biotechs being acquired by pharmas who can take the drugs globally and do the large trials, where there's an on the ground reality that's really different from the over there rhetoric.
Yeah, I think the China thing's a little bit different because I think it's much more pervasive in Washington, and it's set up as the interesting other thing that's interesting about it is it's set up as the lever for almost every proposal, public policy proposal for improving the attractiveness of or government regulation or steps to help capital formation in the United States for the life sciences. The lever on all of those proposals is to say, look, China's surging. If we don't do this, then the United States is going to fall behind China.
Yeah, I
So,
mean
yeah.
they are. So first of all, the United States is going to fall behind China, I think, if it doesn't change its policies. But there's another part which I think is a thread from what Karen, or as we call it, KTT, was saying. Which, Steve, there's been an argument that China is a national security threat here, and I think that inside Biopharma, no one even buys that it's what they're doing with China would be a national security threat. How do you think about that?
Well, I don't know about no one with inside bio, the biotech industry. I think Bio, the trade organization, and its CEO and president, John Crowley, continue to make this the case that biotechnology is a national security imperative for the United States. And that implies that investing in having close ties with Chinese biopharma companies could be perceived as a national security threat in the United States. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I do think that that's something that's talked about a lot. There are policymakers who are pushing for legislative approaches that are going to lead to, if not decoupling, at least distancing between the U.S. and the Chinese biopharma industries. It remains to be seen exactly what legislation is going to be introduced and how successful it will be. But I do think it would be wrong to just dismiss this and say, oh, well, this is an issue that's never going to raise its head again and it doesn't have to be taken into people's consideration.
Interesting. Steve, I think that one thing that we need to keep an eye on is the degree to which investors, because this is like largely what we're talking about, whether the investors are seeing that threat or not. And you're right, it's probably not going away. So we'll follow that. But Stephen, what else came up in your analysis?
So a couple more positive things to share, which I think is always nice. So while the indexes, the ones we think of like XBI, NBI, well, those were down in the first half of the year. I don't think it's actually as bad as it kind of looks seems to be on the surface. So we did an analysis of mid-cap biotech companies in the $200 million to $5 billion range. And actually 2/3 of those saw their valuations increase during the last quarter. So, that was kind of nearly flipped kind of on its head from what we saw in the first quarter and in fourth quarter of 24. So I think that was another positive to look at. And then on top of that, a couple other incrementals. If you've got good data, we're still seeing companies that are able to raise money via follow-ons or pipes. Deals are getting done. So I think, that shows that there's capital out there and available for biotechs that are, de-risking their programs. But on the bad side, I think we do have to turn to the bad side. I think,
There's been a lot of happy talk, I have to tell you, because that doesn't necessarily reflect the sentiment of when you speak to people.
You hit on the point right there, exactly. The bad news is that sentiment remains pretty low. These weren't the most upbeat conversations that I've had with investors in a while. I mean, but a lot of this predominantly stems from two sector-specific policy or regulatory overhangs that basically just haven't been resolved yet. And I think until they do, it's going to remain an issue. So one is MFN, sort of most favored nation pricing in the US, and FDA. And now the caveat to these is that 3 months ago, when I spoke to investors about these sort of broader macro issues, there was almost universal sort of fear that both potentially presented some major existential threats to the sector and that they were these massively looming issues that everyone was super afraid of. That has definitely shifted. More recently, those conversations, have shown that there's been a shift, there's a wider spectrum of opinion or concern about these issues. So I had some people saying that MFN is effectively a nothing burger, that there's nothing to worry about there because they basically are discounting the ability of the administration to follow through on some of these things. I had plenty of other investors saying, no, we definitely know that there will be something done here. The uncertainty just lies in what that actually will be and how it's going to be implemented. And then I had other investors saying, well, we've already kind of brainstormed what the potential solution is going to be, and we don't think it's going to be nearly as bad as was initially feared. So it's quite a wide spectrum, which I think
I want to take that and ask Steve Usden. So Steve, MFN is a nothing burger because the administration is incompetent, or MFN is a really big deal that's going to just reshape the whole industry, or something in between?
In between, I think, is the most likely. I don't think that they're going to give up on it. I think that it's important rhetorically for the president to be able to say that he's done something to lower drug prices in the United States or to reduce disparities between U.S. drug pricing and OECD drug pricing ahead of the midterm elections. The Republicans feel that they need to have a talking point on drug pricing ahead of the midterm elections. So I think something will be done. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to be. My guess is what I've heard is the first step is going to be the White House making an announcement, basically demanding voluntary compliance with some kind of pricing policy that they're going to articulate, and then saying if that doesn't happen, then there'll be a next step. And my guess about the next step is going to be some kind of CMMI, that's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, mandatory demonstration project, because the law gives CMS the authority to invoke demonstration projects that will affect either Part B drugs, those are the drugs that are administered under physician supervision, or Part D drugs that are picked up at retail pharmacy counters or delivered through the mail. And it remains to be seen what that demonstration project would be like, how onerous it will be for the industry, or what the conditions would be. There also is a possibility that some companies may find a way out of it. They may be exempted from it if, for example, they take steps that are perceived as equalizing drug pricing between the United States and OECD countries, something like that. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. The fact that we haven't heard anything about it for the last few weeks, I don't think that that means that it's gone away at all. And it could be that it ends up being something that the biopharmaceutical industry believes that it can live with and doesn't force, tremendous changes in its business model.
That's what I think I'm sort of also picking up, Stephen, in my conversations that I think, reflect what you wrote as well, which is people are no longer thinking this is the biggest existential threat. I mean, if carried through as it was initially, articulated, it probably would be. But I think there's a kind of, look, life goes on. We can't just sit around.
It's true.
Paralyzed, waiting to see what happens.
It's true. But I think, so here's the issue, I think, is that what you just described, Steve, none of that is getting figured out and solved in the near term. That's not happening in the next couple months, right? That's more of a longer term thing to see how it actually is going to shake out. And so that uncertainty then kind of lingers. And then you put on top of that, you have the staffing reductions at FDA, the leadership changes, which so far I had several investors saying that they were actually sort of pleasantly surprised with how sort of the continuity that they'd seen at FDA in terms of drugs getting approved, meetings happening, these sorts of things. But then others saying, well, you're probably not going to start to see sort of the feed through on what this sort of new version of FDA is going to actually do until next year when you have new submissions being made and working there all the way through. But the point is that you won't know soon. So you have these uncertainties hanging over the top of investors about pretty important things about how you go and value assets. And then you add on top of that uncertainties around tariffs and interest rates. And so these all kind of come together. And so in the end, it just makes for a difficult situation for an investor to be able to confidently say, well, I think company X should be valued at a given valuation.
I think another uncertainty that's hanging over it all is what's going to happen with the IRA. It's not known whether the industry is going to get the pill penalty fix that it's been asking for.
Sure.
Right. The administration seems to be holding that in reserve as part of some kind of a deal around MFN. And I would also say that in that same category is reauthorization of priority review vouchers for rare pediatric diseases.
So, Stephen, right, there's a whole lot in your quarterly preview that I'm sure you'll put the link to in the show notes. But, one thing that, I wrote about this week that I think we are leading up to is there are these various forces that are going on. China is one of them. What is happening at FDA? And I really think it's a bolder person than me who can say what FDA is going to look like in the end. But it is certainly not going to look like what it has looked like for the last 10 plus, maybe 20 years. It'll have a new staffing base at a minimum. The number of people leaving and saying that they're going to leave is enormous, notwithstanding what Steve wrote about this week, Vinay Prasad from SEBA saying that he's going to be hiring. That could either be a sign of bold leadership, or you could read that as a little bit of desperation because everybody's leaving. Whichever way you look at it, FDA is not going to look the same. the rising profile of China is not going away. The US can engage or cannot engage, but China innovators aren't going to sit back and say, actually, we'll wait for you to figure yourselves out. And Europeans are starting to find partnerships with China as well. The drug pricing issue, Steve, you've written about this a lot, not going away, not going away. We're not going back to the last 10 or 20 years. The pharma industry might like to. They might think we can dodge this bullet. We can change the small molecule pill penalty in the IRA. We can correct that. But generally, the pressure on drug pricing is something the industry is going to need to contend with. And the last thing is the innovation ecosystem, which we know that NIH has been hit very severely. That's intramural and extramural grants, which is going to change. That's going to be a slower change, right? But it's going to be a big change in where innovation comes from and the pace. And AI is also going to change things. Something Karen is going to start to talk about quantum in that sense. So I feel like there's these various different forces. And at the moment, we're in a real down market. We're still in a down market, and it's going to be a down market for quite a while. As we emerge from it, it's not going to look like the previous cycles. Biotech is not going to look the same. And I think that these things are converging at the same time. Any one of them would be quite a lot. A new FDA would be a lot for our industry. But these four things happening at the same time, I think, mean that we're going to look very different in 5 to 10 years than we look right now.
We're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we will dive right into Karen and her quantum computing. So stick with us and we'll be right back.
Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
Welcome back. I'd like to now turn to my colleague Karen, who I know for the past few weeks has been diving down some pretty deep rabbit holes on quantum computing and the areas in which it could have the greatest impact on biopharma companies. So maybe to start off, Karen, could you summarize how quantum computing works in about, maybe 20 to 30 seconds as a jumping off point?
No.
No?
The answer is no, right. Stephen.
I didn't think you'd be able to. So in lieu of that, maybe you could just share with us what you found.
Well, the gist I'll get into on this podcast is around the special properties of quantum computing and how they map onto applications for biopharma. And to set the scene, quantum computing, it's here, but it's not like big here yet. There is capability. And for those who want to be dipping a toe right now, they could be going on IBM's, I think it's called Qiskit platform. There's ability to collaborate with some practitioners, IBM is one of them, and do some applications in the current time frame. But when we talk about quantum really arriving, it's something that is, I suspect, on the 5, 10, 15-year time frame. I think though, in the larger sense, people will say, okay, quantum has arrived when it can decrypt all of our encrypted stuff. And, so there's a very busy industry at work in terms of sort of finance and defense and things like that, trying to get ahead of the quantum computing world before that sort of moment really arrives. But for biopharma, it's less sort of defensive than opportunity in terms of what can these computers do. And so the first thing is that it's not that quantum computing will be the thing that you use for every computing task. It's quite specialized in terms of the things that it excels at and the things that it does way better than classical computing. And, we have this very high performing classical computers right now of the NVIDIAs of the world. There are certain types of problems for where there will be this big quantum advantage, and biopharma happens to have a couple of those.
And they are?
So one kind of really clear application is taking chemistry and getting quantum with it. What does that mean? So right now, when we look at molecules interacting, bonds being formed between atoms, there is a level of abstraction that is happening in terms of how that's modeled and studied right now. To get down to the realm of tracking every individual electron in the system of your target and your ligand binding is too computationally intensive for our current system. So there's workarounds, there's ways that people approach it now, but what quantum computing could really do is enable that type of modeling where you really are tracking all the electrons. And there's a reason for this, because when two atoms interact and their electron orbitals are, interacting, these are quantum entangled systems. And it happens to be that quantum computing, which relies on quantum entanglement, is good at solving problems that have quantum entanglement as their fundamental underlying principle. So that's one place where, we had some great speakers at our BioCentury Grand Rounds panel on quantum computing. In Chicago, we'll have another panel on quantum computing with a chemistry focus in UK. But that's a place where multiple practitioners are saying this is a killer app for the biopharma industry.
Let me just ask you something. So some of the things you're talking about seem to be about complexity and computer power. And, we know we have a lot of things coming our way. I mean, the AlphaFold, the ability to do very, very complex tasks for protein structure prediction, molecule creation, and so on. They're like the whole next generation. I guess my question is quantum necessary for those technologies really to reach their true potential?
So I'm glad you brought up AlphaFold, because this was something that came up in my conversations. The thing about AlphaFold is that it is training on data. It is AI training on data that says, okay, here's all these proteins we know about and their structure and their evolutionary relationship to other proteins. And we can do training on data, pattern detection, and prediction to things that look like that data. But where that falls short is for proteins where you don't have that kind of data, because they are very not evolutionarily connected to other proteins, maybe a lot of mutations, maybe just really large, people are saying. And so what quantum computing allows you to do that's fundamentally different from the AlphaFolds is take an ab initio first principles modeling approach, where instead of saying, here's a bunch of data on protein structure that we have and what are the patterns and predicting out, we're saying, here are how these atoms are connected and their electrons and their orbitals and whatnot, and let us calculate from the bottom up what that is meant to look like. So that's very different and a lot more powerful and a lot more computationally expensive. And again, it's not just that there's more computational power, it's that this is an entangled system that we're modeling, and the computer has entanglement at its core, and that helps it solve this type of problem better.
So what I'm hearing is that by the time, when this reaches maturity, AlphaFold and so on are old news, right? They're kind of like retro when this comes to be.
Well, I think what I keep hearing is that you're not always going to be busting out your quantum computer to do every task. So for tasks that current methods are good at addressing, you will continue to do it with current methods. And I think even for some types of tasks, the quantum computer may be less good than the classical one, or comparable. Like you wouldn't choose to use the quantum in every case. And so what people often talk about is it's not going to be classical methods versus quantum. It's going to be this integration where sometimes you use the quantum part for this part of the problem and the classical for this other, and this sort of back and forth.
Wonderful. Well, what I'm hearing is that we should have been playing a drinking game for every time Karen said the word disentanglement or entanglement. But thank you, Karen. You can look out for Karen's story later this week. You can also look out for Karen's hit single, Getting Quantum With It, on her next music album.
Stephen, are you going to accuse me of being in the pocket of big entanglement?
Potentially, yeah. Anyways, thank you for that, Karen. That was I'll be interested to read the story and see if I can better understand all things quantum. But in the meantime, we'll finish with Steve. We'll bring Steve in here again. Now, Steve, Marty Makary was sworn in as FDA commissioner on April 1st, meaning that we've just surpassed his first 100 days in the post. So, Steve, how's he done?
You know, he put out a list of his accomplishments for the first 100 days, and he's congratulated himself. I think it's up to everybody to, you can look at it and evaluate what you think of it. Before I talk about Macary's first 100 days, a quick note about a scoop we had last week. Simone mentioned it. CBER Director Vinay Prasad sent a memo to all CBER staff saying he's going to hire a lot of reviewers. He's going to be bringing some of the staff who left in recent years back, and he's going to be hiring new people. I think that if this really happens, it's something that biotechs, patient groups, and FDA staff will view as a very positive development. It remains to be seen whether it's going to happen. So about the first 100 days, Makary put out this list of his accomplishments. The top of the list were things having to do with the food supply. I won't say much about them because that's really outside BioCentury's scope. The second set of things they talked about, he put under the category of accelerating cures. The top of his list is reducing animal testing. That's been a long-term goal of FDA. Was he really done in 100 days? He's published what is called a roadmap for transitioning away from animal testing for investigational drugs wherever possible, and a move to organ on a chip and other technologies. That's all great. It's also things that would have happened regardless of who was the commissioner. Those are things that have been really in the works for a long time. The second thing on his list for accelerating cures is the National Priority Voucher Program. Makary says the program will slash review times to 1 to 2 months for select products. There's a lot not to like about this program, really. To start with, there's the selection criteria. There's two things that you can look at to see if an incentive program is good. First is, does it have clear, transparent selection criteria? And the second is, it should incentivize actions that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't available. Otherwise, it's just a reward. It's not an incentive that leads people to do things that they wouldn't have done. The selection criteria that Makary has announced so far are really vague. No one can predict in advance whether they're going to be eligible. In an interview with Bloomberg last week, he said that he's going to give out these vouchers to companies that equalize U.S. and international pricing. There's so many problems with that idea that we really don't have time to get into them all. FDA's job is to determine whether drugs are safe and effective. Its mission, Congress hasn't asked it to add a third criteria, safe and effective and priced right. That just isn't part of FDA's mission. How's FDA going to know what prices are in the US or in other countries? There are multiple prices for drugs. Which prices is it going to pick? Equalizing drugs could mean raising prices in other countries as well as lowering them in the United States. President Trump seems to believe that higher drug prices in Europe would translate to lower prices in the US. This doesn't seem likely to me. And it sets a really bad precedent to make favorable regulatory treatment predicated on drug prices. Just some examples. When the first AIDS drugs were approved, they had the highest prices of any drug that had ever been launched up to that time. Should FDA have deliberately slowed those reviews because the drugs were expensive? The world would be a much worse place today if that had happened. And finally, there are a lot of reasons to believe that the priority vouchers either will be or will appear to be doled out based on political considerations. And there's a lot of reasons why that isn't a good idea.
But at least the selection criteria didn't involve purchasing a meme coin, right?
No, there was no mention of meme coins. And to be fair, the goals that are there are things that most people will be able to get behind. Increasing domestic manufacturing, producing drugs that are going to be good for the American people, breakthrough drugs, things like that. Those are valid goals. And you could even argue that equalizing drug pricing between the United States and the rest of the world could be a good thing. But again, is it part of FDA's mission, and should it be using regulatory tools to achieve those things? I don't think so. And then the other thing about these reviews that's problematic is the second part of the equation, which is what do you actually get if you get one of these priority vouchers? Makary says he's going to be able to collapse drug reviews from 10 months to a year down to 1 or 2 months. that suggests either that there are going to be very few drugs that this is actually going to be applicable to, because that's not going to be the case very often, or that these reviews are going to be problematic. So again, that's another set of issues. Another thing that was interesting to me is that when he made the listing of his accomplishments in the first 100 days, he didn't mention something else, which is the policy that he's announced on complete review letters. So he put out a statement, he gave an interview, and made a big deal and said that FDA is engaging in radical transparency by publishing complete review letters. There was a lot of excitement when people saw the headline, and then when they found out what was behind it, that excitement diminished considerably. It turns out that the vast majority, if not all, of the complete review letters that FDA released last week are already on FDA's website, and they're actually easier to find by searching through the approval packages than they are by going through the PDFs that were released last week. So that's kind of a nothing burger. So just to correct what I just said, it's complete response letters, not complete review letters.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you, Steve, very much. I think that's all that we have time for today. So tune in to our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, where the most recent episode featured Steve in conversation with Jillian Willett, VP and Head of Regulatory Strategy and Policy at Samsung Bioepis, discussing how regulatory reforms are necessary but not sufficient in revitalizing biosimilars in the U.S. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment or review. You can find all of these stories at biocenturypodcast.com. Thanks for tuning in. We will catch you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how IQVIA Biotech can help you turn your vision into venture capital, go to IQVIAbiotech.com/visionaries.